Righto, so we've received another question from one of the Two Trees Bible Study students. This lady's name is Natasha Lee, and she has two questions. We look at the first one first. We will do this presentation in English, as most of our English listeners doesn't really understand Afrikaans well. But Natasha Lee wants to know, when the Torah says, no bastard must be allowed to come into the congregation, what does that mean? So I do ask that Yahuwah will bless us as we study His Word, that we will not come to our own conclusions and make up our own minds, but that we will look only at what His Word says, and we'll try to find the answer in that. All right, so let's have a look at what the Torah actually does say. According to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, there are three kinds of people that God says is not allowed into the congregation. First of all, he that is wounded in the stones or has his private member cut off. Secondly, a bastard shall not enter into the congregation. And thirdly, an Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation. So, Deuteronomy 23 verse 1, he that's wounded in the stones, so he that has a wound or something wrong with his private parts, or where his testicles is wounded, or the person that has his private parts cut off shall not enter into the congregation. So a person that has his private parts cut off is indeed not circumcised. Some people say that circumcision means you are damaging your whole private part as a male. That's not true. So private parts having been cut off is called an Enoch in the Bible, an Enoch. And that's normally what happened when the enemies of Yahuwah would come to steal away slaves from either Israel or any other nation for that matter. And they would then cut off the private parts of those slaves, especially when they work in the queen's courts. So the king will then bring these eunuchs. That's what the Bible calls eunuchs. And they would actually serve his queen, and he would make sure that they've got no intentions with his wife, and therefore they would cut off their private parts. So those people are called eunuchs. A bastard shall not enter unto his 10th generation into the congregation of Yahuwah. We'll have a look at that. And of course, the Ammonites and the Moabites, because they didn't help Israel along the way when they came out of Egypt, and because they wanted Balaam, the false prophet, to curse Israel along the way when they came out of Egypt. So each one of these individually deserves our attention. There is indeed a fourth kind of man that is not allowed into the congregation, and that is Ezekiel 44 verse 9. Thus says Yahuwah Elohim, no stranger, uncircumcised in heart or uncircumcised in flesh, shall enter into my sanctuary of any stranger that is among the children of Israel. So we actually have three different kind of people here as well. First of all, the stranger. Secondly, the man, whether he's a stranger or not, that's uncircumcised in heart. And thirdly, the uncircumcised in flesh, whether he's a stranger or not. Those uncircumcised are never allowed into God's sanctuary, and the stranger is not allowed in God's sanctuary. Let's just quickly see this also in some other translations. Deuteronomy 23 verse 1. He who is wounded by crushing of his testicles or whose private part is cut off shall not enter into the sanctuary or the community or the congregation or the church of Yahuwah. So that is the first person. So to have your private part cut off is called castration. Here you can see castration. And castration means the removal of the testicles or the removal of your private part. And when you have been castrated, you are defined or called an Enoch. And an Enoch is a man that has been castrated. an ineffectual person. So you are of no effect anymore to procreate, to have children anymore. So especially in the past, in the ancient days, one that was employed to guard the women's living areas in an Asian court. But this, of course, is not just Asian, it was all over the world, especially in biblical times. So the eunuch is a man that has been castrated, and castrated means that either your private part or your testicles has been, or both, has been removed. And then, secondly, a bastard. Let's have a look at some other translations. In the Brenton, one that's born of a harlot, one that's born of a prostitute, is not welcome in the assembly of Yahuwah. Or if a man's parents were not legally married, he's not welcome to join the assembly. Or if he is born to an illicit sexual relationship. Sometimes it might be that you just had a one night stand, and that person that's born is not allowed. According to the Torah, we'll have a look at this, not allowed into the congregation. And then, of course, the King James, a bastard, and the definition of bastard is a mamzer. And mamzer means somebody who's an alien, a mongrel. It's a weird word. One that is born of a Jewish father and a heathen mother. So there's various definitions for the word bastard. It's either a man that is born of a prostitute, and of course, if a man and a woman wasn't married, automatically the woman was called a prostitute. The man should have been called one as well, but nevertheless. Illicit sexual relationships is always, of course, due to prostitution. But specifically, if the father was a Jewish man, the concordance isn't always correct. Remember, these concordance notes are also written only by humans. So in the time of Moses, nobody was called a Jew yet, only way later on. You need to watch the Israel series to understand the difference between Jew and Israel. But if somebody was from the congregation of Yahuwah, if he was called Israel after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the man's father was an Israelite and his mother was a heathen, he was also called a bastard. We're going to have a look at that. And then lastly, an Ammonite or a Moabite. Nothing strange about that. The Ammonites are descendants from Ammon, and the Moabites are descendants from Moab. And Moab, of course, was the descendant of Lot. So these were brothers to Israel, yet they left them to die of hunger and thirst in the wilderness when they asked for food and water. And they wanted to have them cursed because they were scared of them. Biliam, of course, that was rented, the prophet that was rented for profit by Balak when they came out of Egypt. So these are the three areas or the three kinds of people according to Deuteronomy. Let's quickly also summarize Ezekiel 44. So if you look at Ezekiel 44, 45, 46, all the last chapters of Ezekiel, it's talking about the millennium. So here is Ezekiel is talking about the gate for the prince. We know the prince, of course, prophesies towards Yeshua, who is the one that will rule and reign from Jerusalem, from the temple, and from the holy city of God once he has destroyed the enemies in this world. So here we have three kinds of people. First of all, the son of a stranger. And of course, secondly, the uncircumcised in heart. And lastly, uncircumcised in flesh. But actually, Yahweh does say, even any son, he says here, even any son of a foreigner who is among the children of Israel cannot come into my congregation. I don't think it's necessary that we have to discuss why God gave these commandments. It's quite logical. He's an holy God. And just like nothing unholy can come close to a holy God, holy meaning set apart, it's the same as nothing that is in shadow can actually exist in light. So if you try to bring shadow closer towards a light source, the light source will automatically and instantly distinguish the shadow. It's not the light's fault that shadow cannot exist together with light. It is just, that's the law. That's nature. That's logic. That is just how it is. So unfortunately, nothing unholy can come close to Yahuwah, who is holy. But does that mean the same for all these kind of people all the time, all over the rest of eternity? They can never come into God's congregation. What, are they lost now forever? Are the eunuchs and the son of the stranger and the uncircumcised, are they lost? Can they never enter? The Moabite, the Ammonite? How fair is that? And I don't have to explain to you that God is indeed very fair. And there's something here that we may not understand so well. Let's have a look first at if God contradicts himself regarding these 7 types of people. Okay, so let's start with number 1, the Enoch. We can clearly understand why the Enochs were not allowed inside the sanctuary, because the Levites was chosen by Yahuwah to serve him inside the sanctuary. And if any Levite was ever captured as a slave and he became an Enoch, he would no longer be a Levite. And if any slave from another country came into the congregation of Yahuwah, or joined themselves to Yahuwah, or became, through repentance, one of Israel, they cannot become a Levite. Yahuwah's holy congregation was not open for any Tom, Dick, and Harry to just, summer walk in. But is this what God really means when an Enoch returns to him, or an Enoch that became an Enoch because he is a slave and it's not his own choice? For instance, Daniel, if you think about Joseph, if Joseph became an Enoch in the house of Potiphar when he had to serve his wife, would they then also be denied entrance back into the congregation of Yahuwah? Is that what Yahuwah meant? Because Yahuwah says through the prophet Isaiah, and he actually speaks to the stranger and the Enoch at the same time. And he says, "Neither let the son of the stranger that has joined himself to Yahuwah speak and say, Yahuwah has separated me from his people. And don't let the Enoch say, Behold, I'm a dry tree." Let's stop there quickly. So if a stranger who decides to join himself to Yahuwah, to come into covenant with Yahuwah, to ask forgiveness through repentance of his transgression of Yahuwah's law, and who takes hold of the covenant of Yahuwah and becomes the seed of Abraham, the father of many nations, then that stranger mustn't say that he is now separated anymore from Yahuwah's people, because now he's no longer a stranger and he becomes Yahuwah's people. And God says to the Enoch as well, if he joins himself to Yahuwah, then he can no longer say, I'm a dry tree. So think about it. If an Enoch, if he got castrated, he's of course dry. He doesn't have any more sperm. But God says, don't say you're a dry tree. Don't remind me of my Torah that says an Enoch is not allowed into my sanctuary. I'm dry. I cannot come in. Don't say that, because the moment you join yourself to Yahuwah, you are grafted into the olive tree, and then you share in the fatness of the olive tree. You share in the liquid, in the sap of the olive tree, and then you are no longer a dry tree or a dry branch, because the Enoch that keeps my Sabbath and choose the things that pleases me, and the Enoch or the stranger that takes hold of my covenant, these 2 types of men that the Torah says is not allowed into the congregation, if they join themselves to Yahuwah, if they keep the Sabbath days, if they take hold of his covenant, then he will do something to them that's even better than he does for his own people, Israel. Even to the stranger or the Enoch, I will give unto them in my house and within my walls a place and a name better than even my own sons and daughters. I will never cut them off, and they will have an everlasting name. So although your private parts has been cut off, or although you have been cut off from the people of Yahuwah, if you join yourself back to Yahuwah, you are no longer cut off. You are then basically no longer an Enoch, and you are no longer a stranger. So then, of course, you are welcome into his sanctuary. But if you don't join yourself to him, then you are an Enoch and you are a stranger, and then you cannot come into his sanctuary. And Yahuwah continues with the prophet Isaiah. Thus says Yahuwah, Keep my judgment and do justice, for my Yeshua, my salvation, is near to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. To who is my salvation near, and my righteousness, to whom shall it be revealed? The man that does this, that does what? Keep God's judgments and his justice that's found in his Torah. So if we keep his Torah, then the man that does that, the son of man, even the son of a stranger, that lays hold onto Yahuwah's justice and keeps his Sabbath days and keeps his hands from doing any evil, that is the kind of man that, of course, is the kind of man that Yahuwah's judgment and righteousness and salvation has come near to. Yahuwah confirms this further in Isaiah 56 verse 6 to 8. The son of the stranger that again join himself, number 1, to Yahuwah, serve him, number 2, love the name of Yahuwah, number 3, to be his servant, number 4. If you become the servant of Yahuwah, you are no longer a stranger to Yahuwah. Everyone that keeps the Sabbath day is now not a stranger anymore. Anyone that takes hold of the covenant is not a stranger anymore. Even those people I'll bring to my holy mountain. Whereas the Torah says, you cannot come into my congregation. When you join yourself to me, you keep my Sabbath days and you keep my holy covenant, then you can come into my sanctuary. You can come into my congregation. I'll bring you to my holy mountain. I'll make you joyful in my house of prayer. You see, you can come into my sanctuary. You can even bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices. Where do you bring that? In the sanctuary. So when you join yourself to Yahuwah, you are no longer a stranger. You can come into the sanctuary and you can even come and pray directly with the rest of God's own people that has been born from the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because his house, his sanctuary, his church, his own special holy place will be called a house of prayer for all people. Yahuwah Elohim, which gathers the outcasts of Israel, says, I will yet gather even others unto him, besides those that are gathered unto him. So besides the outcast of Israel, you remember the 10 lost tribes, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Besides those that are gathered by Yahuwah, he's also gathering others. The strangers, the eunuchs, the slaves from other nations, and they become Israel as well. Yeshua confirms this in the New Testament in Matthew 21. He went into the set-apart place of Elohim and drove out all those that were buying and selling in the set-apart place. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, it has been written, my house, my father's house, Yotevav's house, shall be called a house of prayer. Isaiah 56 verse 7. So Yeshua confirms strangers, eunuchs, according to the Torah, when they join themselves to Yahuwah, they can come into Yahuwah's house of prayer. Remember, Yahuwah said in Isaiah 56 verse 8, he will gather even others besides those that he are gathering. Yeshua confirms in John 10:16, other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they will hear, shema my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. So the strangers and the eunuchs who shema and keep the Sabbath day and take hold of the covenant, they are indeed the other sheep that Yeshua must and will and want to gather, because he is also their shepherd. Yahuwah himself confirms this in Ezekiel 37, where he joins the house of Ephraim and the house of Judah back together. He's talking not only to Judah and Judah's children, but also to his companions. And not only to Joseph and Ephraim, his children, but also to all the house of Israel and all the companions. So anybody like with Egypt that came out of Egypt, whether they were Egyptians, eunuchs, strangers, nations, whenever they decided to follow Moses and Joshua and leave Egypt together with Israel, they became part of the 2 sticks restoration of Yahuwah's kingdom. Moving on to the Moabites and the Ammonites. If Yahuwah really meant that no Moabite or Ammonite or somebody from another nation, even like the Canaanites, could ever come into his congregation, then why did he allow Rahab to become a great grandmother of King David and Yeshua himself? And why did he allow Ruth, who was from Moab, she was a Moabite, to not only come into his church or his congregation or his gathering or his people, but also to become the great-great-grandmother of David and Solomon and Joshua himself. Because it's not about the Moabites or the Ammonites that didn't give Israel food along the way and that wanted to curse Israel through the false prophet Biliam. But these Ammonites and Moabites who come into God's congregation, remember what Ruth said to Naomi: your people is now my people, and your God is now my God. So again, like the stranger, like the Enoch, if they decide to come into God's covenant, then Israel becomes their people, and the God of Israel becomes their God. Oh, and sorry, let's not forget about the mamzer, no, the bastard. So in various translations, we can see that Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, verse 1, in Afrikaans, she's called a hoer, which means a prostitute. In the Brenton, she's called a harlot. In the ERV, she's called a prostitute. In the ISV, a prostitute. In the King James, a harlot. And if we go into the Hebrew, the word for harlot is Isha Nashim, and it's got the meaning of an adulteress, a woman that is an adulteress. The TLV, she's called a prostitute, and the TS, the Scriptures 2009, a whore. In the Webster, she's called a harlot. And in the YLT, a harlot. Some people do say she wasn't actually a whore, she was just an innkeeper. But most of the translations, and even if you go into the Hebrew, it's got the meaning of a loose woman. So remember now, Rahab was chosen out of all the Canaanites in Jericho that was destroyed because of her faith. What was her faith about? Remember, we said, even the Enoch, the stranger, the Moabite, any nation's people that has faith in Yahuwah, that believes him, that repents and returns to him, they become part of his people and they can enter into his holy place. So what was it that made Rahab a whore? Because now her children are whores. Remember the definition of a mamzer was even if a Jewish man or an Israelite man marries with a prostitute, that child is a bastard. And that bastard can never, according to the Torah, enter into the congregation. But yet we see that when a prostitute returns or turns back or turns to Yahuwah and chooses to believe and have faith in him, then she's no longer a prostitute. And then her child is no longer a bastard. Look at how she proclaims her faith in Joshua 2, verse 12. Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by Yahuwah, your God, your Tevafe, since I showed kindness unto you. Because why? I believe that Yahuwah, your Elohim, he is the Elohim in heaven above and in the earth beneath. That is her statement. That is her faith. What is the right word I'm looking for? She's confirming that Yahuwah is the only God there is, and therefore her faith has saved her. In the New Testament, Hebrews 11:31, by faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those people that didn't believe. She had faith. The other people in Jericho didn't have faith. She believed God. The other people didn't believe him. She believed in God. The other people didn't believe in him. So by her faith, by her mission and her vision statement, she confirmed, your God is the only God in heaven and on earth. And therefore, she transferred from being a prostitute to becoming a queen. She was in the bloodline, in the genealogy of Messiah. And in Matthew 1, verse 1 to 25, we have the whole genealogy of Joshua. And here we see in verse 5, Solomon begot Boaz by Rahab. So Rahab was the mother of Boaz. And of course, Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. So here we have Rahab the whore and Ruth the Moabitess. And both of them are in the generation of Yeshua, the son of David, the son of Abraham. They are both queens. They have both been taken not only into God's congregation, into his people, but God took them all the way into his royal bloodline. Is God contradicting himself? Because the Torah says no bastard is allowed into the congregation. But here comes a Moabite woman who's not allowed in the congregation. She gets a son. Her son's name is Obed. He's basically qualified as a bastard now because his mother is a Moabite. Or Boaz. Boaz is a bastard. His mother is a prostitute. But when you come into God's covenant, you lose the identity you had before. The Enoch, remember, don't say anymore you're a dry tree. You are losing your identity as a dry tree. The stranger, don't anymore say you are separated from God's people. You are losing your definition of separation. You are now joined to Yahuwah. And God sees you like he sees even Abraham and Isaac and Jacob themselves. And lastly, we have a look at the heart and flesh uncircumcision, people not allowed into God's sanctuary according to the Torah. He explains it beautifully to us in Ezekiel 44. And you will say to the rebellious, the house of Israel, that is doing abominations in the eyes of God, in that you have brought into my sanctuary, you, the rebellious house of Israel, you've brought strangers into my house. You brought people that are uncircumcised in their heart, uncircumcised in their flesh, to come into my sanctuary, to pollute it, even into my house. When you offer my bread and the fat of the blood, and they have broken my covenant because of all your abominations, you have not kept the charge of my holy things. But you have said, here it is. This is what you need to understand. You have said, you, house of Israel, have set keepers of my charge in my sanctuary for yourselves. You have taken strangers, uncircumcised in the heart, uncircumcised in the flesh. You have brought them into my sanctuary, and you have made them keepers of my holy things. It's like if you're my son and you're in charge of, cleaning up the kitchen, and you go out into the street and you go and you get a Satanist from the street or a criminal from the street, and you bring the criminal into my kitchen, my clean, nice kitchen that you are supposed to keep clean, and you bring them to come and keep my kitchen clean. I don't want a criminal in my house to keep my kitchen clean. I want my own son, my own child, after he's made food for himself, to clean up my kitchen, because my kitchen is holy. It's set apart. It is set apart for making food. It's holy for making food. But it's not holy and set apart if you bring strangers and criminals and people from the street in there to do the work that you are supposed to do. So this is what God is complaining about. Israel was supposed to keep his holy things holy. And you can do that with strangers and uncircumcised, or even eunuchs who comes into the covenant, and then of course they will become circumcised, first of all in heart, secondly they'll become circumcised in the flesh. And for that you have to please do this circumcision Bible study. But when the stranger becomes circumcised in the heart and later on in the flesh, he's no longer a stranger, and then he can come into the sanctuary. But when you bring strangers who have not taken hold of my covenant, and you bring them into my sanctuary, that is where the problem lies. So this is why God has the commandments of no strangers or eunuchs or bastards or Moabites or uncircumcised to come into his sanctuary. Those definitions only apply to those kind of people when they are still in rebellion or in ignorance or in disobedience to Yahuwah. But the moment you join yourselves to him, the moment you come into his covenant, you automatically become part of his people. And then whether you were an Enoch or a bastard or a Moabite or a stranger or an uncircumcised before, you are now no longer those things. You have received a new identity, That's why Yeshua has brought us this transformation of the new identity we find inside of him. Because through him, through his word, the word of God that became flesh, Yeshua, and through repentance by his blood atonement, we can lose being called an Enoch or a bastard or a Moabite, because we were all those things before. But now we are called names better than even sons and daughters. Remember, he says in Isaiah 56, the son of the stranger that joins himself to Yahuwah, the Enoch that keeps the Sabbath days, I will give in my house and within my walls a place and a name, an identity better than that of sons and daughters. I'll give them an everlasting name, and they will never be cut off. So I hope this explains the difficult questions of bastards into the church a little bit better. And I hope that we will each go through that transformation, slowly but surely, from being an Enoch, a bastard, a Moabite, a stranger, and uncircumcised, to becoming sons and daughters of the living Elohim.